everyone. Hi, it's lovely to see you all. Welcome to our second in the series of events on autism and the arts. Tonight we'll be hearing from a couple of really amazing autistic writers, Joanne Limburg and Kate Fox. So the way it'll run is they'll both give a reading from their latest collections, and then we'll have a discussion about autism and poetry and related issues, after which we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So if you've got any questions, if you think of any questions at any time, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, if you can put them there rather than in the chat box, because unfortunately Bob from Autistic Nottingham is unable to host this event, so I'm running the tech and hosting, so I can't keep an eye on the chat as well. But any questions that you put in the Q&A box, I'll pick up, and if we've got time, we'll put as many as possible to Kate and Joanne. Thanks ever so much to Jenny for doing the BSL interpretation for us. When Kate and Joanne do their poetry readings, I'll be screen sharing the text of the poems. Jenny will also be providing the BSL interpretation. There's kind of a splitter that will appear on the screen, so if you want to resize Jenny or the text and make either of them bigger, you can do that. What else do I need to say? Oh, buy the books from Five Leaves if you haven't already. I'll be putting the buying links in the chat at some point. And finally, the last bit of housekeeping, we'd really like to thank Autistic Nottingham for partnering with us on this series and helping us put it together. And of course, the Arts Council for providing funding for these online events. So without further ado, I will introduce our first reader, who's Kate Fox, who works mainly as a stand-up poet and as a broadcaster and speaker. She has published several pamphlets and collections, including Vox Populi from Smokestack, Chronotopia from Burning Eye, and this year recently from Nine Arches, the Oscillations. She's a familiar radio voice. She's presented Pick of the Week on Radio 4 several times and appeared on Radio 3's The Verb several times as well. She's a regular contributor to that. She's also a gentle activist. Now, I got this off her website, so I'm going to ask her later what gentle activist means. And a campaigner for the voices of Northerners, the working class, women, and the neurodiverse to be heard, mainly through teaching and running workshops in schools and for community groups, and by speaking, writing, raising awareness of and tutting at injustice and equality. So I need to screen share the poems and I will hand over to Kate. Let me just get this sorted, apologies.
Thank you, Pippa. Shall I start talking until the screen sharing begins? Hi, everyone. Really nice I was going to say to be here, but I'm quite often here, literally in my office. It's nice that you're here. Well, not in my office. It's nice that we're all in this virtual space together. I'm going to experiment with, I'm going to read the poem off the screen. I think you've advised not to do that, but I don't know why. So I've picked 6 poems from the Oscillations that are particularly, I would say, connected to being autistic. Although my idea of which poems those are changes all the time. But this first one definitely relates to the idea of masking, camouflaging, which is apparently why so many fewer females are diagnosed as autistic. Masks. Here is a girl stood alone in the middle of a white aircraft hangar who needs somebody to take her hand. Here is a girl joyously kicking up brown leaves. People mostly see only one of these. Here is a girl wearing a badly fitting clown mask, plastic mouth rim digging into her top lip, and a girl in a lacy blue bodysuit which raises a red rash on her tummy. Here is a girl who can make a room full of strangers come to hug her like their own. Here is a girl who doesn't quite recognise herself, though there are always plenty of photos. Here is a girl who became a woman, who can see behind masks and round corners and hear the gaps between words and things where light pours like falling water. Here is a woman who knows she can travel as fast as rewind to where the girl stands alone in a hangar filled with the sound of arrivals and departures. Here is a woman who knows that it will never be too late to stand alongside the girl in the hangar, take hold of her hand and squeeze. Quite a few of the poems in the collection cover how at the start of the first lockdown last year, me and my boyfriend both had COVID, obviously not tested at the time, and everything went weird and disconnected, as it did for all of us. Skimming. The walk measured our breaths the first day. Our knees ached going up the steps as we limboed under the tree whose fall seemed to echo the world. We sat on the stone beach by the river, spectated the other side as if it was a film. How much movement there is and sound, I said. How quiet and still it is, you replied. A week later, we will walk into the scene and you will say change is sometimes just a walk on the opposite side of the river. I am there now, skimming stones uncertainly, dunking them with a splash. I had the knack once, but needed to be retaught or unlearn the urge to throw. My mother was not patient about how clear I needed instructions to be, how much longer than for other people it takes me to learn by seeing or building up muscle memory. Now I am quick to disguise the ways in which I am slow. So mercurial with words, I couldn't learn your house alone. There you are across the water. Will you remember how it really was when we found this place together? Where did you go? And actually, just to say a little bit about that previous poem, it could possibly be describing dyspraxia, which often co-occurs with autism. Or just perhaps the general executive function difficulties that often accompany being autistic. And basically, I'm so quick to read and learn words, and people can't understand how I can be so clumsy when it comes to something like making a cup of tea. I will spill things, the steps will be done in a weird order, the kitchen will end up in chaos. Anyway, what could be called communication. You might find them staying near the walls or clutching their earphones, rocking from foot to foot and looking just above their audience. They might be wincing at sirens, saying pardon a lot in crowds, clutching the rails on angled walkways, wondering at the calm faces of everyone else. Sometimes they rest a foot on a crossed ankle in such a way that others will click love in recognition when one of them writes a Facebook post about it. They might have coloured lenses or squint perpetually into the sun. They think everyone can see the fluorescent lights humming. Their eyes dart or fix, so they might be called evasive or invasive. They're stroking a finger, twiddling with their hair, tearing up paper, something in a mesmerising rhythm. They do not always recognise each other. They were often to be found clustered around tea urns, outside where it's quiet, in the toilets at parties, in wombs and rooms where everybody shares the same nose because of those contagious genes. So they can perpetuate their tangents and straight lines, build forests of themselves, sending micellar releases of carbon and water to those who need them. Survival tips, encouragement, warnings, impulses of sound and light. And I think in that poem, we have stimming, the term for self-stimulating. Autistic people might twiddle with things, rock, fiddle with things, or use words or light as a stimulation. And contrary to how autistic people are usually depicted on their own, on the telly or in books. I personally love being in groups of autistic people. And this next poem, Not Breaking the Egg, is set in an autism conference. And a non-autistic writer was telling us all about her autistic son. And she responded to one of my questions by telling me that autistic people lacked emotional intelligence, which was annoying. Not breaking the egg. Bright blue, red, yellow. I can't stop looking, but then we have to cover it with white wool. Water and soap, turn and rub, press and mould round the egg, she says. You will feel when it is felt. The famous writer tells us that my kind only have feelings for ourselves. I can't see how the colours will get back on the outside. Will something dissolve? I had told the front row girl with the rainbow fringe and eyebrows they made me happy, and she flapped her hands at my prints and how things matched. It is cutting in the end. Scissors along the bottom, so the inside becomes the outside, more pressing and moulding, relieved to be told it's harder than you think to break an uncooked egg. I don't think I said, actually, my boyfriend, the boyfriend of skimming, is autistic too. But there are many ways in which we connect and many ways in which we disconnect. And it's a constantly interesting dance of connecting and disconnecting. Exile. And of course, it felt like coming home. We had both been exiled so long, but told the ways of our country were wrong. I learned the customs of the new one all too well. They are drilled deep into women, so no one will be able to tell we are not from here. Now I don't belong in our homeland anymore, but fail to fit the new country too. Your reflection of the gap between here and home makes me feel close to you and on my own. I don't think that this last poem, I was going to say, I don't think it's about, is it an autistic poem? Oh, no, it feels like one of the most important poems in the collection that brings together so many of the other themes that are in it about class and northernness and not belonging and the physical impact of place on someone's health, or on the violence that they might experience. It is an autistic poem too, but more subtly. It's lots of things. Sorry, I wouldn't normally pre-explain my poems, but you know, since we're here. Right, breathe. 1, 2, 3. Be mindful, they say. If your epithelial cells are under attack, just breathe. You can be whoever you want to be, they say. Despite the death of industry, expel the coal and metal dust from your lungs, just breathe. We are all equal. We are all free, they say. Even with a knee on your neck, just breathe. The sea and the trees unclog in this pause. Open to the sky and just breathe, breathe, breathe. Ooh, that was the first time I properly got to see Jenny then. I loved the thing. You see, at its best, the BSL interpretation can be a lovely dance, can't it? So thank you for that, Jenny. I will now mute myself and disappear and look forward to hearing Joanne.
I'm so glad you finished with that poem, because I really needed reminding to breathe after that reading. It's just amazing. So we'll now move to Joanne, who is a writer and teacher who's published 3 poetry collections with Blood Axe, the latest being The Autistic Alice, which by the way, included a pamphlet called The Oxygen Man, which was originally published by 5 Leaves.
And edited by Pippa, thank you.
Edited by Kathy.
Edited by Kathy. I'm so sorry, Kathy. Edited by Kathy, designed by Pippa, published by Ross. Thank you all.
Yes, that's a very good summary. Her new book, which is published in July this year, is called Letters to My Weird Sisters. And it contains a series of wide-ranging letters to 4 weird sisters from history, which address topics including autistic parenting, social isolation, feminism, the movement for disability rights, and the appalling punishments that have been meted out over centuries to anyone deemed to fall short of the norm, which is very appropriate to people with autism, along with any other minority, really, pretty much. So without further ado, I will hand over to Joanne, share the poems, and disappear myself.
Okay, thank you very much, Pippa. This first poem is relatively recent, and it's something I've written since The Autistic Alice came out. And I was influenced by disabled poets like Raymond Antrobus and how they've taken other texts and sort of subverted them. And so I took the National Autistic Society page, What is Autism? And I kind of tinkered with it. What is poetry? Poetry is a lifelong condition that affects how people perceive the world and interact with language. Poets see, hear, and feel the world differently to other people. If you are a poet, you are poetic for life. Poetry is not an illness or disease and cannot be cured. Often people feel that being a poet is a fundamental aspect of their identity. Poetry is much more common than most people think. It used to be thought that poetry predominantly affected white middle-class men, but it is now understood that poets from other groups tend to go undiagnosed. Poets often do not look like poets. They may, for example, have neither flashing eyes nor floating hair. Some parents of poets say that other people simply think their child is naughty, while adults find that they are misunderstood. Poets have exceptional language skills, but they may still find it hard to make themselves understood by others. They have a tendency to hyper-focus on the physical qualities of language, often repeating words or phrases. Poetic language is also characterized by its unusual prosody and excessive use of neologisms. Poets' unusual and highly focused interests can make it very hard for them to navigate the social world. They may find it hard to form friendships or maintain healthy relationships with partners and family. Some poets say the world feels overwhelming, and this can cause them considerable anxiety. This is another reason why taking part in everyday family, school, work, and social life can be harder for them. Other common comorbidities include depression and substance abuse. The exact cause of poetry is still being investigated. Research suggests that a combination of factors, genetic and environmental, may account for differences in development. Poetry is not caused by a person's upbringing or their social circumstances, and is not the fault of the individual with the condition. There is no cure for poetry. However, with the right sort of support and encouragement, poets can learn to channel at least some of their energies into occupations which are productive and do not cause difficulties in social interaction every time they are mentioned. So this is a poem from the Autistic Alice, and it predates the poems in the Autistic Alice sequence itself. And when I was first diagnosed in 2012, I was 42 then, and it made me look back over my life, and there were these odd moments, lots of them, that I couldn't account for. And suddenly with the diagnosis, I could. And one of them was my relation to language and what I did with it and what I tried and sometimes failed to make it do. And this is about me when I was 3 years old. The loft day. Some words have extra meanings, not understood, but felt. They mean like a colour in a painting. They mean like a note in a song. They mean like I was meaning it one Sunday in the early 70s, when strong gales shook the grass from spearmint to white and back again. Our cousins came to visit, but not for any reason, which puzzled me. I felt pushed to express it all, the wind, white grass and puzzlement that made the Sunday other than itself. So I said, "This is a loft day." And when my mother just went, "What?" I realised she wasn't feeling it. So this is the first Alice poem, and it has in common with the last one that it's a poem of me and my mother slightly misunderstanding each other when I'm about 3. So I was trying, when I wrote the Loft Day poem, to find a way to write about my autistic self and reclaim the history of my life in an autistic way. And then I discovered that by putting it in the third person, which most of these poems are, I could gain some distance and think about it and write these difficult things without feeling too exposed. And I'd always had a great love of the Alice books, Wonderland and Looking Glass. And of course, a lot of you may know Lewis Carroll is thought perhaps to have been autistic. But what I also like about them is that it's a little girl, very logical, very curious, going through a world and occasionally getting shouted at for no reason by totally unreasonable adults. And I related to that very much. So this is one where there isn't much Alice in it, not much Alice from the book, except for the name and the concept of an unbirthday. Alice is 3 and she knows it. She's sitting face to face with daffodils underneath the washing line, which is a roundabout for clothes. Her mother pegs some clothes up, gives them all a ride, and pegs again. Alice feels like trying something. "I'm 4, she says. "No, you're not," her mother says. "You're 3. She picks Alice up and pegs her to this rule. It isn't saying it that makes it true. So I remember hearing that because that was the experiment. I thought, if I say it, my birthday was a few days away, I can tell because of the daffodils. And I thought, if I say it, will it bring my birthday forward? And it's like, okay, that didn't work. So one thing that happens to Alice a lot in the book, she gets big and she gets small, and it's always quite distressing and disruptive. And Kate talked about dyspraxia. Your body can feel very foreign to you. And adults can interpret this as being naughty or careless. And I used to sometimes get in trouble at school for things that were dyspraxia, I guess. And this is about that. I'm about 7 at this point. Big Alice. Without meaning to or even knowing, Alice has grown huge again. It starts with her name in an angry voice. "Look what you've done." Since when were her hands so far away? One stuck on her face and covered in ink. The others on the desk by the upended carton with milk seeping out. "Don't just look at it, pick it up." Alice does, but something's wet somewhere. "She's got it all over her skirt." Alice finds her feet and stands on them. The scrape of her chair is thunderous and rude. "Go to the office, get a change of clothes." Eyes watch her thudding damply to the door, the dumbest Alice lump they ever saw. I think the big Alice is always about also about the feeling of being exposed suddenly, that everyone's looking at you and you don't want everyone to be looking at you. So this poem, The Alice Case, is about being looked at. It's about, I guess, what we'd call epistemic injustice. That's an injustice in terms of how you make knowledge. And it's how we've been defined by professionals, and we're finally, in events like this, finding our own voice and talking back. And And if you remember, Alice meets the caterpillar in Wonderland and Humpty Dumpty and Through the Looking Glass, and they're both very good examples of those peremptory, unreasonable, demanding adults. The Alice case. The problem with Alice, the caterpillar says, is her rigidity of thought. Yes, says Humpty Dumpty, and her lack of empathy. Indeed, says the caterpillar, her mind blindness. Yes, says Humpty Dumpty, her inability to read faces. Indeed, says the caterpillar, or tone of voice. And then, says Humpty Dumpty, there's the flatness of her affect. Alongside, says the caterpillar, the strangeness of her prosody, as well as, says Humpty Dumpty, her adherence to routine. Not forgetting, says the caterpillar, her repetitive behaviours, or her failure, says Humpty Dumpty, to understand a joke, or her lack, says the caterpillar, of any feel for metaphor, or her inability, says Humpty Dumpty, to hold a proper conversation. Excuse me, says Alice, may I say something? Of course, says the caterpillar, you may say something. And then, says Humpty Dumpty, we'll tell you why it's wrong. Stray and got in there. So another figure is the Red Queen, who's, the most authoritarian and sharp, literally sharp looking figure in both books, I think. I suppose there's also the Queen who chops people's heads off, but the Red Queen is up there. And she personifies all the way into which I was sort of bullied into womanhood. And she isn't just my mother, I should say. She's a lot of women. Alice and the Red Queen. Alice takes her first step late. Before she can take a second, the Red Queen grabs her hand. Stand up straight, she says, and stop that, whatever it is. Alice, are you listening? With that, the Red Queen starts yanking Alice in and out of rooms. Say hello, she shrieks. Say thank you. Say your name. Don't chew your hair like that. There are others keeping pace, but no one has to yank them. They can run and speak together. Smile, coos the Queen. You won't crack your jaw. Why are you so serious? Because it is a serious effort, this running to keep pace with all the other ones. Stop sulking, snaps the Queen. You need a bra, some heels, and sit with your legs together. Growing up makes running harder, but the Queen is merciless, dragging Alice far from home. Have some fun, she orders. Get a boyfriend, have a drink. Dance for me, girl, dance. Dancing is worse than running. Every bit as fast, but now there are steps to remember, and the Queen still shouting, You're drifting, Alice. Look how far ahead the others are. Alice glances at the Queen and sees she's now as tall as her. Screw you, she says, and walks. I do like to end on that note. Thank you very much.
Oh, we need Kate's poem again, just to remind me to breathe again. Thank you both. That was absolutely amazing. So the Alice case really struck me because it just exemplifies that as autistic people, we're often told by non-autistic so-called experts, directly or indirectly, that the way we think means that we've got this kind of inherent lack of creativity. So we can't understand the concept of metaphor and non-literal imagery, and there's an assumption that we're unimaginative. But you've both just demonstrated absolutely clearly that this isn't true. I was wondering if you thought maybe there might be some element of truth to it. So might there be some difference in the way we think that even makes us better poets than non-autistic people? Kate, if I could come to you first with that one.
Well, I think Joanne's Alice poems brilliantly show how the conditions in which one might become creatively blocked can be created as an autistic child growing up, and those conditions are the ones where you're continuously told you're wrong, or you are kind of shouted at, you're frightened, you're pestered, mithered, to give a northern word, and actually I now characterize my creativity as having been through periods of great creative block when I was in unconducive, unfriendly circumstances, and then great creative flow when I'm among people who will facilitate me and listen to me and support me. I mean, the greatest time of that has been since I became a poet and found the poetry community and poetry audiences from being in my late 20s. So in terms of inherent autistic creativity or not creativity, I'd say it's about environment and context and conditions more.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, there's no denying that particularly autistic women, like all of us who were diagnosed late and didn't know why we were different, that it's, you know, the differences do get suppressed to some extent, which I guess suppresses our creativity and ability to use words. But then I suppose if we're diagnosed late, then we're not told we're not able to do it. So
that's the thing. When I did a PhD in my late 40s, and I went to get my disabled student allowance thing, and the assessor kept looking at my notes and looking at me, and he said, I would have expected someone with a profile like you to have dropped out of your first degree. And I thought, oh, was I supposed to do that then? Nobody told me I was supposed to drop out, so I didn't. I mean, I hung on to my detriment in a lot of ways, but I didn't drop out. I didn't know that was what we're supposed, that's what performing being a disabled person is.
Do you think the difference between being autistic and not being autistic might help with writing poetry or make our poetry different from?
I think every poet's different. I think it was interesting what Kate said about the creative flowering she had when she came into poetry, because I think poetry is a world where difference is pretty standard. You know, whether it wants to label itself or not. I mean, Muriel Spark, bless her, in her very blunt way, when she was in charge of the Poetry Society for a while. She had an awful time. And she says in her autobiography, I have never met so many abnormal people before or since.
Yeah.
And she didn't mean it as a compliment, but you can flip it and say poetry is a place where you can go. And I think I've said this before, use language in a non-standard way, and provided you're consistent and you do what you do well, you will be allowed in. I mean, yes, there are factions. You know, there are so many factions and disagreements in poetry, but actually I think that people focus a lot on that. But actually the truth is it's an extremely broad church.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Yeah, it does seem to be more accepting of difference than society in general. Poets want to be surprised and challenged, in my experience.
And actually, I think it's quite difficult for, I think people who are poets and are seen to be conventional in any way are looked at with great suspicion by other poets. not necessarily fairly, but that's what I was thinking about when I wrote that what is poetry thing. There's such a huge overlap somehow between, you know, you're a poet, you're creative, this is good difference. You're autistic, that's bad difference. Because one thing people would say to me when they were not believing me is, oh, but you're just creative.
Yeah.
Which does lead to a question, which maybe now is not the time for, because we probably need to move on to the next question. But is it, productivity is valued generally in society, isn't it? And actually that's one of the reasons that disability generally is so stigmatized, because there's the idea that, oh, well, you might actually be a less productive capitalist worker, and then what would we do? But I suppose if you're a autistic poet and you're working as a poet and producing poems, it's kind of hard, it's harder to disapprove of you because you're producing.
Yeah.
Created a glitch in the system.
You're producing and also you're glitching, because try as it might, I don't think they've ever managed to make a really profitable industry out of poetry. Yeah. And that's a saving grace in some ways. I mean, not when you're trying to sort of pay your bills, but when you're wanting to be free creatively.
That's very true. That is very true. So let's go back to the autism thing. So you're both late diagnosed as autistic. Could you perhaps reflect a bit on how that diagnosis and the impact of the diagnosis on your identity and self-perception has affected your work and how you think about your work? Maybe I'll throw that to Joanne first.
I think I'm nearly 9 years on from that now, and I'm still in the process of unfolding that. And I'm just trying to think about, I'm just thinking about all the ways that I thought were wrong to write or wrong to use language. I thought maybe I can use those, but I've had so many years of masking, not just as a human and a woman, but as a writer, that this sort of peeling away is taking a long time.
Do you find it sort of liberating at all? Or is
yes, yes, because there's always this fear that people won't accept you if they're yourself, and sometimes it is like that, but sometimes you find that when you are, I don't believe, you know, I've read too many books to believe in the authentic self. I'm too much of a humanities scholar to believe in that. But when you're not giving up so much energy to covering up, something comes out that people can engage with. And even if it's not how they are themselves, they respond to that real communication.
Yeah, and that's what's at the root of good poetry anyway, isn't it? It's communicating another experience in a way that someone can understand it. And I think you've both done that brilliantly with your poems about autism. So Kate, could you maybe reflect on how your diagnosis affected your work and the way you think about it?
I suppose it almost gave me permission to start making work about being autistic that I didn't fully have before. I utterly failed, sort of, to talk about being autistic in the form of stand-up comedy prior to my diagnosis, and I couldn't make audiences believe it or laugh. So that's quite an impressive failure. But now I've made a show about kind of the history of autism activism, refracted through a history of Doctor Who, and that show would possibly be touring now were it not for a certain pandemic of our acquaintance. And poems in the Oscillations are, as I've said, I would describe them as reflecting my autistic experience. So yes, it's kind of given me a permission, I reckon, that was not there before, and perhaps a platform. I mean, part of the reason I took up the diagnosis in 2017 while teetering on a knife edge of Shalashanta was, I can speak from this. It was quite a political decision, having met other autistic performers and writers, and thought I want to add my voice, because the more of us there are, the better.
Yes, I mean, for me as well. And actually there's I'm not going to say who she is in case she's a mess, but there's someone in the audience who, when I first got diagnosed, I was thinking, should I come out in my work and not in my work or not? And she just said to me, think of the good you can do.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Another voice added to the hundreds of thousands of millions there are. So, I mean, you've both written about your autism really effectively and really sort of communicated to me the differences between the way you're autistic and the way I'm autistic and the way each of you are autistic. And, you know, I mean, there's the old saying that, you know, one autistic person, you know, one autistic person, but it's so true. We're all very different. I've tried to kind of write about my own autism, and I found it really hard to do. I think you kind of answered the first part of this, which is, why did you feel it was important to write about autism? But how have you kind of approached writing about it in general and your experience in particular? Again, maybe I'll go to Joanne first.
In lots of different ways. I often find that I approach something in poetry first and then in prose. So I needed a way in, a structure for it, because the thing about autistic experience, it's not present in the language. And you don't realise till it's not there how much you rely on what's already been said or written for the past however many thousand years. And so you need to find something you can use from scaffolding. So I used Alice and Kate used Doctor Who. So, you know, you need to find your scaffolding. And with the writing and the intervening years, I read more disability theory and more stuff by autistic people, and I became more politicized. So I think it's sort of been, I mean, not that I was unpolitical before, but I think, you know, owning that disabled identity, that autistic identity, it's sort of radicalized me in what I hope is a good way and not a destructive one.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah.
Kate, I think you probably agree with a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. It is. I mean, I don't think, maybe when I was trying to do stand-up comedy about being autistic, I was trying to do just the thing of going, I'm going to write about being autistic. And if I just did that would definitely, I think, continue to lead to a blank page or things that don't work. As Joanne says, it's something about having a framework to hang it to or next to. Plus, actually, a thing that I really needed to do that's still really valuable is listen to the words of mainly other autistic adults, not all late diagnosed, and become absorb autistic culture, which I think more so than many other areas of disability culture, I think, well, certainly someone on my Facebook page once told me in no uncertain terms, autistic people don't have a community or a culture. And he had 2 autistic sons, so he definitely knew. So as I was at Treat, the conference where 200 odd autistic people gather every year, I looked around and I thought, I think that this looks like a community to me and feels like a community. And I saw myself reflected back in so many people. And that has given me the confidence as well to write more about my own experience, seeing it reflected in others.
Yeah, I just saw a comment from someone saying that autistic culture is difficult to get in from late diagnosed people. And I think there are generational differences. And I think there's also a difference in being told you're autistic as a child and growing up with that identity, for better or worse, anything else, and finding it later on. It's the same identity, but it's a very different experience. And also, you know, we have experience of no allowances being made for us, which doesn't mean that the young people have an easy time and how dare they, but it gives you a different kind of armoring. And I think it's, I mean, I know some people my age who are sort of out and proud, but it's harder to be out and proud and own that. And I look at the younger people and the way they dress and the way they occupy space in the world and the way they talk about themselves. It's very different from the way I do or I could. But I suppose, you know, there are generational differences in non-autistic people. So maybe we need to normalize that.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's kind of a revelation, isn't it? Discovering that the reason you're different is actually a thing, and there is another community of people out there, and you do have a tribe.
Yeah, because I know that there are lots of autistic writers who deal with sci-fi or with fantasy or with fan fiction or with comics, and these are all areas I know nothing about. But it's obviously a place where they find commonality and great self-expression, and it's a really creative part of the culture. But it's something I don't understand at all, but it's something where a lot of certainly younger autistic people feel very at home. No, I don't think it's easier for younger people either. I think it's different for them in a different way. Difficult for them in a different way.
Yeah. Okay, so time's moving on. I think I'll go over to questions from the audience now. I have noted one or two in the chat. I don't actually have the cognitive ability to read the chat and the Q&A box. So if you've got a question that you particularly wanted answering that you've put in the chat, if you could just pop it in the Q&A box, that would be great. I'll start quickly with one that was emailed to us before the event started, from someone called Al, who says, I'm a female with an adult diagnosis of autism and ADHD and want to make a career of writing. She's been looking at developing her skills through studying an MA in creative writing by distance learning, but she's held back by making the wrong choice as there is a lot of discussion and critiquing involved. And she knows that could potentially put her off. Can you offer any advice?
I mean, as a creative writing teacher, this is a bit of a bugbear of mine, because I'm always saying it's not an MA or BA in extroversion. It's an MA and BA in writing, which you largely do sitting by yourself with other people not around. And having said that, I'd say that you need to be clear from the outset, and they are legally required to recognise this, what sort of access you do and what you can do and what you can't do. And if you're choosing an MA, choose one where they'll accept that you will engage with it in your own way, because you have as much right to engage with it as anyone else.
Which is actually good general advice for approaching life as an autistic person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, legally, you have the right for them to make reasonable accommodations.
Yeah. Okay, so we have an anonymous attendee who says, do you like the term neurodiverse, or does it have any baggage with it for you? Maybe Kate, if you could.
Yeah, so I really like the term neurodiverse when it's used, as Nick Walker uses it, as a kind of political paradigm that's very much about acceptance of difference. And I think neurodiverse is also currently used as a term to make things that are not traditionally very sexy and cool, like autism, sound more cool. And actually, as someone who has worked in having to brand things that are not cool as more cool than they are, e.g. as a performance poet for many years, I'm sort of okay with that. And I love that if I talk about neurodiversity, someone with ADHD will say, oh, that's me, or someone with dyslexia, and it feels like we're broadening who we're speaking to, the we in that case being perhaps autistic adults like me. So very on board with neurodiversity. Kind of beware it can become depoliticized, but maybe that can also be useful as long as we remain alert to what that actually then means we lose.
Yeah, I think it becomes depoliticized and sort of diluted when it becomes, hey, everyone's different, which they are, but some of us are different in a way that makes it hard for us to move through the world, and some are not. And so people quite often use neurodiverse when what they mean is neurodivergent. But I don't like to make, I mean, there are differences, but I'm always very reluctant, partly because I live among the non-autistic. I'm very reluctant to sort of make it to them and us.
Some of my best friends are not autistic.
Well, some of mine too. They really are quite nice.
Yeah, they talk, you know, so you can understand them. It's amazing, isn't it?
And they're so articulate.
Yeah. That's the word I was looking for. I've obviously lost all my articulacy. Yeah, okay, it's gone. Okay, right. So Kathy Lennon has asked, as someone who's trying to write fiction, is whether she can create characters that aren't really just herself or real people, such as historical figures, whether she can imagine being someone else enough to create a different character to herself who's realistic. Or whether that's part of her autism. And she says, and I totally agree, the theory of mind stuff, where the Simon Baron-Cohen theory, where autistic people can't understand other people's minds, which is, yeah, I'm not going to get started on that. But it does make autistic people feel really self-conscious about all this, as Kathy says.
It does, yes. It makes you feel like you can't. But actually, in my diagnostic interview, I said I'm not really a novelist, and she said, well, most people aren't novelists. That's not on the list of traits for being autistic. So I think you need to put it into context. And there are a lot of autistic novelists. If you think, for example, of Ellie McNichol, who's had such great success with young adult novels. And there are lots of autistic writers out there of all kinds. I mean,
but I really have to interrupt and point out, Joanne, that in fact you did write a really, really good historical novel, like in the guise of Queen Anne. I just wanted to.
Yeah, but I did loads of research, and I was looking for no reason I can explain on Goodreads yesterday at the novels, and some people thought I was doing it wrong. And I think they were expecting sort of, more obvious story and less research. So I think I wrote possibly the sort. I like to know where I am. I mean, I don't like making things up, but actually, having read a lot of creative writing by a lot of people, very few people can make it up straight off. They generally start by imitating, or they start close to someone they know, or they start with some kind of prop. So the idea that there's someone who just sits there, and this stuff comes out of their head, it's a fiction itself. Ironically, nothing comes from nowhere.
Yeah.
So maybe you can do it, maybe you can't do it, but I don't think it'll be because you're autistic if it's not something that you can do. But you can write novels with real people in, you can write novels that are about you and not own up, you can write novels that are about you and own up and call it autofiction. It's all allowed. It's only when you're autistic that it becomes a symptom rather than a stylistic choice.
Go for it, Kathy. Go for it.
Here. Okay, so Nikki says, do you think we can give ourselves permission to write about autistic experience? She hasn't been able to get formally diagnosed, but is recognised, understood and accepted by all the autistic people she knows as autistic. What would you say to those of us who remain self-identified and know it's behind our creativity?
Yeah. I also want to say, go for it. I know that I felt like I needed the validation of that diagnosis because of where I was in my life at that time. Probably a few years on now, I would also have remained perfectly okay with self-identification. It's really important. We're a lost generation as it is of autistic adults, particularly autistic women, but not just autistic women. And gosh, that's without mentioning non-binary and trans people whose experience doesn't fit into the boxes of current diagnostics. It's really important that we have self-identified neurodivergent people speaking up, speaking out.
It's still really hard, and I think, as someone said earlier, it isn't any easier for young people. There are still particularly lots of young women who can't get diagnoses and girls who can't get diagnoses, but they know. I mean, I knew as soon as I came across a description of an autistic woman, and actually in a way I knew my whole life. I knew I was out of step. So I don't believe there are loads of people announcing themselves as autistic to be interesting or to excuse bad behavior. I don't think it's something you'd come out with that wasn't true.
Yeah.
I agree.
And, you know, and I think a lot of autistic experience is experienced by people who are not yet or will never be diagnosed. And it makes me feel quite angry, actually, in retrospect, that in order to have permission, talking about epistemic injustice, to have permission to know something about myself, I had to go to a psychologist and have them give it back to me in language that didn't quite fit me in order for it to be considered real knowledge. The more I think about that, the more cross I get.
Yes. And actually, going back to my introduction at the beginning, the thing of being a gentle activist and tutting, I'm feeling so much less like I want to be a gentle activist when it comes to that, because there's really good reason to be furious. I could out-diagnose any NHS psychologist or psychiatrist. Just put me in a room with 20 people. I'll tell you who's autistic in 2 seconds. Anyway.
Exactly. So send me into a school, send me into a primary school classroom, have me watch for a day, and I'll go him, and her.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. We've got time for just one quick question. I know there's others that haven't been answered yet. I mean, perhaps I'll ask them to maybe email me the answers so I can put them in the YouTube video notes. So one last quick question. Do either of you have any thoughts on autism and class? David says, once in the throes of his late diagnosis journey, he was chastised by an earlier diagnosed person that he had middle class autism.
What? What is that?
Oh,
that's new on me. But Kate and I had a conversation about this, which went into my current book, didn't we, Kate?
Yes. And it's very well, like, yes, I did a PhD about class and comedy, and so much to say. But yes, to cut a long story short, I mean, my presentation is more working class than Joanne's presentation in terms of how we talk and present ourselves. And we have mused on how that could lead. So for me, I'm more likely to cut across norms of behaviour when I'm in my full flow, or having a meltdown, or just being autistic in some other way, and that could lead to more problems. I'm more likely basically to get carted off by the police than Joanne is, but still a lot less likely than a black autistic person, for example.
But my issue with being middle class is that in some ways I've acquired more armor and more passing because I have to, because being middle class is very complicated, and middle class British English language is absolutely not saying what you mean, and being nice for a very specific definition of nice. And so you might argue I'm more oppressed by that. On the other hand, when I pass like that, it puts me in a position to complain to the manager about someone like Kate, doesn't it? And it becomes a form of aggression against her, a form of very middle class, nice middle class white lady aggression. Yeah, but I don't know if that's got anything to do with but I know that I interrogate this in a book. I know that the tools that I've acquired to pass, they're things that reinforce my position as a white middle class cis woman, and so by doing so they reinforce other people's more marginal positions. And I have to kind of walk that back somehow.
There's a lot of I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is really interesting around intersectionality and how different characteristics interact with each other.
Yeah, I think Kate and I talked about having different performances available to us, because I can be the terribly nice lady and Kate can be the blunt northern woman who gets things done, and both of those can be useful in some situations and a liability in the other. Yeah.
That's very, very true.
Because one thing that autism does make you, if you're able to survive, you become very, very aware of the performative nature of all social life. Very aware.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think we're going to have to finish there. We've already gone just a little bit over. So thank you so much to you both for sharing your poetry and your reflections on autism and your writing. And thank you very much to Jenny for providing BSL interpretation.
And thank you, Pippa.
Oh
yeah, thanks, Pippa. It's so great to have events like this. It feels really important. Thank you for helping make the space.
And thanks for everyone's comments and corrections and so on. It was very useful to see those coming up, going through. We don't mind being corrected. That's one of the great things about being autistic, isn't it?
you want to get things right.
No, it's helping. Yes.
I just finally want to say that if you've enjoyed this evening, don't forget to sign up for next Thursday's event, which features Sonia Bouet, the autistic artist, contemporary artist, who is also late diagnosed autistic and has done an awful lot of work on autism and the arts and inclusivity. So you might find that really interesting if you want to sign up for that. So thank you very much. And goodbye.